Good morning. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So welcome to With Open It's Possible, the 2023 Open Education Week virtual conference hosted by Texas Tech University Libraries. We want this to be a welcoming space, so any form of harassment will not be tolerated and may result in removal from the virtual conference. As a courtesy to our speakers, please keep yourself muted, and we encourage you to turn off your video during the presentation. This session is being recorded and will be posted to the library's YouTube channel after the conference has completed. Closed captioning has been enabled as well. And so let me put this link into the chat for everybody. So this will go to our conference homepage where you'll find a brief description of the conference, presentation schedule for the week, as well as information on our keynote speaker. Use the chat feature at any time to submit questions. I will be monitoring those questions as they come in and will ask them to the presenters during the Q&A portion. If you'd like to ask a question anonymously, feel free to chat me directly and just indicate that you would like to remain anonymous. You are welcome to turn on your camera and verbally ask questions during the Q&A portion. Now I'd like to introduce our session today. With open is possible, with free it's attainable. So this research aims to look into potential benefits of implementing free public education, college education in the United States. And they'll be looking at existing promise programs within Texas, such as Texas Tech's Raiders Promise and UT Promise Plus. So please join me in welcoming our speakers, Samuel Allen and Leslie Sotomayor. Samuel, okay, yes, go ahead.
Do you want me to start sharing or?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, let me see if I can figure this. Oh, where is it? Sorry. My name is Samuel Allen. She said, I am a political science major at Texas Tech. This is my junior year, and my minors are women, gender studies, and sociology. So for this research specifically, I wanted to start off with the historical framework, specifically acknowledging that college as an institution used to solely be for upper middle class white men. However, after some time, it has transitioned to a more middle class women and people of colors diversity. So some of the research questions that I wanted to address within this framework was, what do we mean when we say when open it's possible? How should we talk about education inequalities, and how do we achieve equity within this secondary institution? So for the first question, what do we mean by when open it's possible? We are stating that policy intent does not always indicate policy outcome. The two examples that I want to pull for this is Brown v. Board of Education and women's representation. So first, for Brown v. Board of Education, the concept behind it and what many pinpoint with it is that it ended racial segregation. However, when looking through and analyzing Brown v. Board of Education as it correlates within racial segregation, what it has appeared and what has many pointed to is that in actuality, rather than it ending racial segregation, it just painted it into a different picture that we're arguing is economic segregation. An example of this within the educational framework would be the richer versus poor school districts, which, if you're unfamiliar with how the US system is within public education, specifically high schools and other primary institutions, are mainly funded through property taxes. And because of this, and because of redlining and Jim Crow laws, this has caused the richer school districts that are surrounded by richer neighborhoods to have more access to education opportunities, educational resources, and higher teachers and higher what's the word? I'm sorry. Technologies, while the poor school districts don't have these necessary resources, and because of this, there's a large economic and educational gap and inequalities. The second example I want to pull for this policy outcome and policy intent is women's representation. Specifically, I want to focus within Pickett's own form of representation. She argues that there's four types of representation. However, the two I want to focus on is her descriptions of formal and descriptive representation. Firstly, formal representation as a concept is basically the legal right to participate within the political spectrum. So, this within women's representation would be when women receive the right to vote. Descriptive representation is mostly proportionate representation, which is if 50% of the population is female, then 50% of the legislation should also be female. What's a disconnect and how this is framed within this own framework of the presentation is formal representation would be the idea of policy intent of giving women's representation, and then descriptive representation would be the outcome that doesn't correlate because of a lot of different factors within gender research, but this is just another example within our own system how these two groups are facing systemic discrimination. So this leads to another question. How should we then talk about education inequalities if policy intent does not always indicate policy outcome? We're arguing that we need to look through it within an intersectionality lens. Intersectionality as a concept is a lens through which analysis is considered through between different stratas and how they interlock and intersect. So then how do we use intersectionality when we talk about secondary institutions and educational values? We're arguing that we need to include voices of historically oppressed peoples. These specifically would be race, gender, and class. When we talk about race within the educational framework, we talk about BIPOC, which for those who don't know, BIPOC is a group for Blacks, Indigenous, and peoples of color. Specifically within this framework, we would talk about how Blacks are only 12.7% of the undergrad student body. And with peoples of color, we would bring up how Hispanic Serving Institution, HSI, which TEX is a part of, its body consists of 26% Hispanics, yet its faculty doesn't reflect this or represent this, with only 11% of the faculty being Hispanic. When we want to talk about women, the 2 points that I want to pull from that kind of correlate within each other is the single parent statistic and the student parent dropout statistic. So for a single parent, the gender ratio within this is 81% of mothers are single parents, while only 16% are fathers. So this large gender gap is an issue, especially when talking about student parent dropouts, where student parents have a higher rate of dropping out with 52%, while non-student parents have a dropout rate of 32%. This issue, this study found that is because of time, where especially when it comes to parents having to attempt to continue their education while also providing for the family and providing for the family unit as a whole. So when we take into account that 81% of these individuals are mothers within the single parent, and then including the dropout rate, it is kind of evident that when we have tuition increasing this much, this causes issues with more women dropping out than men. The last section I want to include is class, specifically the gender pay gap and the education gap. So for the gender pay gap, when we talk about all women compared to men, 83%, for every dollar a man makes, all women included would make 83 cents. But this is more fractured when we go into the specific race, specifically Hispanic women, which only make 57 cents to the white man dollar, and then a black woman who only makes 62 cents to the white man dollar. When we want to talk about education gap, we have 41.9% of all white individuals have a bachelor's degree, yet when we talk about bachelor's degrees within Blacks and Hispanics, we see that number very disproportionate with 28.1% and 20.6%. These data and stats are extremely relevant within class itself because of the factors that income and education have within socioeconomic mobility. So then how do we achieve equity with this systematic disproportion and discrimination within these groups? We're arguing that we need to create a universal promise program. By one note I want to expand on within this is that this idea is something that is not new. The United States has had these type of programs before. um, I believe in the 60s and 70s. It's just the specific cuts within the universities have dismantled this form of program. So we're not arguing to completely radicalize different policies. We're asking to bring back these policies to help alleviate this economic inequality. So, what are promise programs? In For most of them, promise programs are university policies which attempt to assist low income students by providing complete funding for mainly first year students. In Texas, the large systems I pulled from are Texas Tech's Red Raider Guarantee, which was founded in 2008, Texas A&M's Aggies Assurance, which was also founded in 2008, and then now recently UT Systems UT Promise, which was founded in 2020. So our issues within this program is specifically the requirements needed to assist within it and what the program actually does. So firstly, the program is more threshold focused than actually assisting students. And what we mean by this is a lot of programs have your family needs to reach this specific income or below it. It needs to fit within this little box that we have decided are the individuals who are needy, and who are desperate for this program, rather than these are the circumstances that these individuals face and these are what should be included. Moreover, it only covers tuition, so it doesn't cover programs that within the class that are essential or textbooks needed within the class as well. And lastly, some of these promise programs are only accessible for first years. So if an issue, for instance, if there was a traumatic event that happened, or a student's funding was from this one source and now this source is no longer able to provide for the student, or their income has dramatically decreased, they would not qualify for the promise program, even though they would technically fit within this little box that they have decided individuals within that box would deserve the program. So what would we mean by expanding it to a universal? Firstly, we would shift the threshold focus to meritocrat focus. For those of you who don't aren't what's the word I'm looking for, aren't familiar with that term, meritocrat is a philosophy meritocracy, which argues that individuals' place in society should be based rather more on how much work they put in and achieved versus what they were given. So how would this work exactly? It would be more accessible because we would have a GPA focus. So as soon as you finish high school and move to college, transition, your first assessment would be your GPA from your high school, and then moving onwards, if you maintain that. And rather than it being for only first years or individuals within this little box, it would be accessible to all undergrads who meet this requirement. The second component within the universal program would be to expand resources to both open access and OERs to allow this more accessibility within the university itself and help accommodate for the systematic oppressions that many of these individuals face. So why would this help alleviate this educational inequalities and educational accessibility? it would eliminate because it would eliminate the class barriers to college access. For instance, the price of college has increased dramatically, and resources for classes such as textbooks and outside programs have also increased and has hindered the ability for some individuals to succeed within their own college experience and college journey. It would also allow for all voices to be seen. This is pointing back to how this box that we have decided are for individuals who deserve the program versus individuals who don't, such as the middle class income peoples of color who um, still face the systemic oppression, yet they don't fit within this box, so they are not considered individuals who need the program. Another instance in single family households, a lot of individuals don't necessarily are like barely like the poverty lines here, and then they're just like slightly above it. So they don't consider it, even though necessarily they should. What does the data say within it? I wasn't able to find illustrative data within the UT Promise program. So I had to pull from the Aggie Assurance, which I think is a better pool because it has been in effect longer. So the State of Prior, they both were founded in 2008. So we would see the graduation rates increase within after 2012, which from these two graphs we see. And we're interpreting this data because of the correlation between working students and higher dropout rates as conducted from this study, and as well as the study conducted within student parent dropout rates. And this is so prevalent because when looking at NCES's their comparison within full-time students and full-time working experience, 40% of undergrads also work while full-time while taking college full-time. From that data, 43% of those individuals are women, while only 35% are men, which illustrates the gender gap within it. And this data did pull from all undergrads. So even filtering it between the 16 to 24, it still shows a 37%. I want to reiterate with research questions. When we talk about when open it's possible, we're talking about policy intent does not always equal policy outcome. And how we should talk about education inequalities within this framework is through an intersectionality lens so that we can achieve equity within our institution and provide more accessibility and openness by providing those assistance and more expanding programs to allow for the universities to compensate for the systemic discrimination that a lot of individuals face. And then this is my works cited. I'm going to hand it over now to our Dr. Sotomayor, who is going to help facilitate this conversation.
Thank you, Samuel. Fantastic presentation. You did a wonderful job. And so we wanted to open it up for discussion and Q&A and maybe unpack some of the larger social issues that Samuel addressed in this presentation about gender, class, BIPOC experiences, and university and college settings, and administrative enforcement, and opportunities created within them. And so we open it up for any reflections, comments, or questions that anyone in the audience might have. And we have some further points that we would love to discuss as well. Are there any questions or reflections at this time? Feel free to either unmute or use the chat.
I really appreciated the presentation, Samuel, and especially all of the data. And I was wondering if there was kind of any pieces of data, because you did talk about, of course, the UT's program hasn't been in existence long enough to really gather good data. Was there any other data that you were trying to find that you weren't able to locate?
There were two. It was West Texas, not West Texas, University of Texas at San Antonio. They also have a program. It's, I believe, called Bold Promise, which was also implicated in 2008. However, while trying to find this data, the only evidence I could find was starting in 2012, which doesn't really help because it doesn't reflect the prior and after. Um, I believe it was also West Texas A&M. I had some issue trying to find as well. Their promise program is Buff Promise, for the same reasons as well. It implemented in 2008, but the data only started after 2000 and I believe 12.
One of the other points that I think is important, or two other points that I think is important in conjunction with the research data that Samuel shared, is that noticing that since the pandemic and COVID, right, the impact to women's careers and accessibility into the workforce, right? So because of the pandemic and COVID and so much of our everyday lives having to be reframed and shut down to the public in so many ways, right? For instance, childcare not being available for families, right? Caregiving responsibilities taking on a whole nother dimension in many regards. Those impacts then to everyday life, we saw that many women were the ones that were letting go of their careers and jobs in order to meet caregiving responsibilities, right? It wasn't necessarily men making those decisions, right? And so that is an impact to the representation in different career and workforces, right? Socioeconomic status, income, right? And so that adds another dimension to this conversation now in a semi post-pandemic world, right, that we're living in, right? How do we recuperate that? The numbers are not recuperating. And so that's another invisibility to some effect in this conversation, right? When we're thinking about who's going to college, who's earning degrees, and then going into the workforce. The other component of this is the invisibility of domestic private space labor and work, right? So a lot of the domestic responsibilities oftentimes fall on women within the household, right? And so that's another component to this conversation because that's not paid labor, right? That is oftentimes referred to the second shift that a lot of women have to deal with, right? They're working their jobs and then they have that second shift of coming home to take care of the children, groceries, domestic work, cooking meals and this type of stuff that is not valued. It's not paid labor, but it's still work, right? And adds on to the invisibility of what is being done. Are there any other questions or reflections? Laura?
I had a question. So I actually got to listen to your presentation through piggybacking off of Yusuf's Zoom until we were able to get links for all of us to get in. So I did actually hear your presentation. It was really good. But I had a question about how, like, what kind of, I don't know if necessarily pushback is the right word, but in the current like climate of, we're getting rid of DEI offices across the nation, or we're kind of seeing this kind of pushback against this inclusivity kind of discussion. How is this being, like this very idea of the universal expansion of these programs being kind of addressed? Or are people like saying, oh, this is a really great idea, but we don't think it'll ever happen? Like, what is the kind of likelihood that you're getting out of people when you talk to them about that?
I think from my experience, And from the experience I had by researching and listening to other discussions within this framework, the main pushback is that one, it's the who's going to pay for it concept. And then the other concept is this is just a utopian idea, it's not attainable, and that this is just the world that we live in, and there's nothing we could really do about it. And especially from the new pushback when we talk about diversity and inclusivity, it's now harder to bring in these concepts of stratas within discrimination because we can't talk about how a lot of these stratas and groups of individuals are being discriminated within the system itself and the inequalities that exist within it.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
And I wanted to add, Laura, as well, that as faculty, the conversations that I've been hearing and a part of with colleagues, not only like across the board in different institutions, I'm not speaking specifically to TTU, but, professors across the United States that I'm engaging with, these, especially the DEI, right? We have kind of like, that's a big highlight right now. One of the things that has come up is that scholarship and research that challenges, right, these traditional white supremacy, patriarchal canons, right, and fights for social justice through a DEI initiative and lens, oftentimes we're considered a threat to the institution, right? And so that then really not only undermines, but it threatens our job permanency and job positions available, our programs and departments that do have this as foundational praxis, right, for the work that we do. And so I think it's a very real problem, and a very real threat for programs like DEI, obviously, but even women's and gender studies across the nation. And even, my fields are art education, women and gender studies, African studies, right? And these are programs that even before this conversation were already marginalized and threatened to begin with. And now with this layer of direct, explicit targeting makes it even harder, right? Where, do we even have much of a voice at the table at this point because of these initiatives being supported institutionally through the administration and politics. So I think it's an excellent point. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Samuel, this is Joseph Pruitt from Angelo State. It looks like my camera is not working right now, so to give a background for where I'm coming from, and for I'm a white male librarian working at Angelo State, so there are some biases that I need to consider in my own opinions and things. Also, something else is that I have worked in the private sector. I've only been in recent years in higher education, so there's maybe some bias there. There are a couple of things I wanted to ask you. Is to make sure I understand correctly, what is the goal of in the end of this research? What do you hope it will accomplish? Oh. And what is your goal? What is your dream with this research?
My personal goal is just being able to educate individuals on these inequalities that a lot of individuals face, because for me, being white and being male, I do have a lot of privilege within my own system and within the system that I was given. So my education advantages, for instance, part of the reason why I'm able to attend TTU was because of the dual credit system that I was a part of, which helped alleviate a lot of the student debt I would have taken on. And then also the state waiver that I received. So the only, if I have to pay for college, it would be my final year of college. And that has allowed me to maintain my GPA ability and my understanding and navigation through in my own education experience. Um, Being that said, I do understand through other people's perspectives that they aren't given these same opportunities, either because of their own oppressions within the system they face. For instance, a lot of schools don't have dual credit programs, or they're not able to fit in within the dual credit program because they aren't given the resources to be able to access this advance throughout it. So for my own goal would be to help advocate for the voices who aren't able to express their own needs through my own experience and through my own privilege that I was given. If that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks. I think some of the data that you shared early in the presentation really points to that. Where I found that to be very helpful. I just knowing that from my perspective, how polarized the political environment is. I think now, do you plan on going forward and publishing some of the research that you're working on right now? Or what are your plans for the?
I do want, if I had the opportunity to, I would love to be able to publish this types of research to help bring in more awareness, because one of the things that I've learned within my own education's experience is the power that students have and researchers have within their own fields, through the power of citations, by being able to alter, because when looking at research, you have to be able to acknowledge that all the research that has been through the foundation of it and through the foundations of multiple fields are built upon the experience of white men. So it's not inclusive to all the other individual races, classes, and genders that also experience within this knowledge boundary. So if for my own thought, I would love to be able to advocate this types of information that is not really talked about because of the roots that a lot of knowledge has.
Thanks, Samuel. Thanks for answering my questions.
I wanted to bring our attention to some of the comments and questions in the chat. One of them in particular by Sabrina, mentioning that programs including open access and OER materials would help with affordability, but how else could these materials help to support these programs and other equity issues? So maybe we can talk a little bit about that, how OER and open access sources for curriculum. What are the other benefits of using that, right? Aside from the financial barrier, what are some other benefits of that? And I would I know it's something that Samuel and I have discussed about OER materials and open access through what he just mentioned with citations, right? Expanding the canons in our disciplines, right? So that oftentimes there are tokenized representations in the canons that are not highlighting underrepresented and underserved voices, marginalized voices within mainstream traditional canons. And so it offers then more accessibility to diverse scholarship and research that is not being promoted in our classes and curriculums, right? So I think that's one of the other advantages to using OER and open access is that we are diversifying the curriculum canon in our classes, as well as making resources available for little to no cost for students. But Samuel, did you want to add anything to that?
I think carrying on from the concept of diversifying canon, I think by having it more accessibility and more openness, it provides more diversity, not only within the canon itself, but also the students' own perspective. Because a lot of students go in with this specific mindset of what this is, how it is, and they aren't able to get the information within different fields or different like untouched knowledge. Like there weren't a lot of studies conducted about how grades working and dropout rates, how they all correlate. And I feel like if we had more openness and more accessibility within scholarly work, this would provide more intersectionality within the work itself.
Excellent point. Yeah. Anyone else? Any comments or questions? Or maybe
It did also bring to mind our keynote speaker, Jeff Gallant, talked a bit as well about how with open, one of the key things we have to think about is the continued availability of these materials past students graduating. So kind of into that workforce, they would still be able to access these materials, so that kind of future impact even into the profession, I think may be an interesting way to look at equity issues as well.
any other questions or comments?
Thank you so much for what you've shared. This has been really enlightening, and appreciate the time and the effort put forth. I was wondering, when creating specific open resources, how much attention is paid to the primary audience?
So the primary audience, meaning the students that are in these classes or taking these courses?
Yes, who would be your primary audience for in this particular discussion, or in this particular articles, the specific resources? I know we've brought up some discussion about the politics that's involved, legislation, moving the needle in that way. Are we attending to those who may not be as aware, or are we working with, is the audience the students? Who would you say was the primary audience?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I'll speak from a faculty, right? As an educator, creating curriculum for my classes from my perspective. And then Samuel, maybe you can share some thoughts as a student on the other, right, in that reciprocal relationship. So I'm looking at it through the lens of we're all learners, right? Collaborating through class curriculum is one of my focuses, right? When I'm curating curriculum for my classes. And so because the canon is oftentimes a white supremacist one, right? Male, white, centered in many of the college courses offered. I'm very intentional about bringing in OER open access materials that speak from the fringes, right? From marginalized perspectives or considered marginalized perspective within the canons and interdisciplinary work that I'm in. And I feel that this is crucial in order to decenter the historical context that has so much misinformation, and that it doesn't have a full holistic context when we're speaking about many of these social issues, right, and their impact and ripple effects throughout society, and larger conversations. So I think that's very important, right? One of my favorite, for example, OER resources here at TTU is the social equity archives, right? Or the equality archives, where the centering of these underrepresented voices is at the core of speaking out to these social issues, right? And those can be applied to any discipline, right, in a variety of ways. And the curriculum that is curated through those archives are usually, in my experience, have been multimodal, right, for diverse types of learners with different disabilities and abilities, for different experiences throughout life, right? I have a lot of intergenerational students, right, within my classrooms. I'm sure we've all witnessed that, right, where they're at different stages in life and they have different responsibilities that they're juggling. And so I think that being intentional about curating our curriculum with OER resources that addresses a variety of different experiences that may not be addressed in the expert canon in our fields is a real crucial component of it. And then also what is relevant to our students, right, in today, and bringing that historical to the contemporary connection, because a lot of this, like Samuel had said at his beginning of his presentation, isn't necessarily new, right? These aren't new ideas, right? But they have been here and then cut, and then, right, that political back and forth, and has not been established, where the theory and the practice aren't necessarily meeting. But Samuel, as we're wrapping up, we only have about 5 minutes. So if there's anything else you'd like to share, and we can probably close out, I think, Sarah, in the next few minutes.
I think drawing onto your argument with the my main focus when it comes to students is that, especially once they're leaving their high school, when it's very test focused, and then coming into college where it's now shifted to critical thinking, and how does this affect, especially with my field within political science, how it's not really this, it's how does this concept affect this concept. Without OER, I feel like the direction that it is going through is going to continue within non-critical thinking, by not allowing new concepts to be brought up, and for students themselves to be able to think on their own, versus, because for colleges, the institution is focused on one of the main aspects is socializing, being able to add in and learn different concepts. Without open access or OERs, I feel like that will start to slowly grip away.
Well, thank you so much, Samuel and Leslie. This was a great presentation and even more fantastic discussion. I always appreciate very engaged discussion. So thank you, everybody, for attending. We do still have another session tomorrow, so please take a look at I'll put that into the schedule into the chat again for anybody who did not see that at the beginning. So thank you, everybody, so much for attending.
Thank you. Great job, Samuel.
Thank you for the opportunity.
You did a fantastic job, so thank you.
Yeah, you were amazing. Thank you both so much.